This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by University of Nebraska Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is A Different Trek, Radical Geographies of Deep Space Nine by David K. Seitz. In A Different Trek, geographer David K. Seitz offers the first full-length interpretation of the rich political world-building of Deep Space Nine, Star Trek's prescient but often overlooked fourth series, which ran from 1993 to 1999. Building on previous studies of race, capitalism, and geopolitics in Star Trek, Seitz argues forcefully against the tidy bracketing of domestic movements for racial justice from global anti-capitalist and anti-colonial struggles, contributing both to science fiction studies and to geography's rich engagement with critical ethnic studies. Adam Kotsko, author of Neoliberalism's Demons, calls A Different Trek a remarkable guide to a remarkable series. A Different Trek by David K. Seitz, out this month from University of Nebraska Press. Dig listeners receive a 40% discount when they use the code 6AS23. That's 6AS23. There's a link in the show notes. Click it. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. A specter is haunting today's podcast. It is, of course, the specter of the Communist Manifesto, which I'm discussing with China Miéville. Miéville writes that many critiques of the Manifesto, and of communism generally, are caught up in what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, the bedrock ideological premise that we simply cannot move beyond the system that we live under. It's true. Capitalism has proven remarkably resilient, and Marx and Engels did believe that the proletariat would put capitalism in the grave on a rather short time scale. But today, in 2023, industrial capitalism still has not been around for as long as feudalism was. And so, while they did fail to anticipate capitalism's multi-form capacities to stabilize itself through reforms and interventions, it's also still far too early to declare them to have been wrong. In 1848, the year of the Manifesto's publication, Miéville writes, quote, "Bourgeois civilization wasn't firmly established. Rather than the nature of today's late capitalism, it was its earliness that was a complication for Marx and Engels, those fascinated critics. This early capitalist text still provides us with resources to clarify the terrain of struggle alongside a compass orienting us to beyond the horizon. We can't predict the future. The very notion of late capitalism is itself beset by a certain optimism, an optimism that we must fight to earn. It's up to us and the struggles we build together to ensure that we are indeed living through capitalism's twilight years. There are no guarantees. We here at The Dig are playing our modest part in that struggle by providing all of you all over the world with ruthless criticism that we all need in order to understand the world and then change it. And we can only do that because those of you who can afford to support the pod do so at patreon.com/thedig. A monthly contribution of any size at all gets you access to our wonderful newsletter by email. A contribution of at least $10 a month from listeners in the U.S. will get you a book or books, or a Dig tote bag, or a Dig mug delivered to you in the mail. Listeners elsewhere can get Verso ebooks. This podcast is overwhelmingly listener-supported, and it's your support that allows us to put out every episode with no paywall so that everyone can listen regardless of your ability to pay. So if that's you who can afford to contribute and can afford to pay $5, $10, $20 a month, please do your part. Do me a favor, push pause, click the link in the show notes. The minute you sign up, I'll get an email letting me know, and that'll put a smile on my face and help secure the long-term viability of the pod. That's patreon.com/thedig. Oh, And before we get started, I want to announce that we will be doing a live video event with China Miéville, co-sponsored by Haymarket Books, where you can come and ask follow-up questions to China on this interview. The date for that is August 3rd, 1 p.m. Eastern. There's a link in the show notes where you can sign up. Okay, wait, that's not it. One last thing. As we've done for the past few years, we are doing fewer episodes for July and August so I can try to take something approximating a real vacation. So 1 or 2 weeks a month, there will be no dig for July and August. If you run out of digs, you probably haven't run out of digs. Please peruse our vast archives at thedigradio.com. There are hundreds of episodes there. Okay, here's China Miéville, a best-selling writer of fiction and nonfiction, and a founding editor of the journal Salvage. His website is chinamieville.net, and Salvage's website is salvage.zone. He's the author of A Spectre Haunting on the Communist Manifesto. China Miéville, welcome to The Dig.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here.
Let's start with the question of the genre. What is a manifesto, and how does the answer to that question shape how we should read this manifesto? One important point that you make is that it can be unfair or misleading to evaluate everything in this text as though it's a truth proposition. Many passages are not so much statements of fact so much as exhortations. Just as we might chant at a protest rally, I believe that we will win, even though we know we might lose.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, it's no coincidence that I start the book with a discussion of the manifesto as a form, as a genre, as you say. And partly that's because I think so much of the discussion around the manifesto in particular, the Communist Manifesto, has been hamstrung by this, in some cases, I think bad faith, but also I think just kind of just mistaken way of reading. Now, I should say I would extend this to all texts. I think that there's not enough in kind of critical reading. There's not enough attention paid to the forms of text and the way they're doing the different things they do. But certainly very, very particularly in the case of a manifesto, part of the point is performance. Its performance is exhortation, almost incantation to some extent. There's, the language itself is very important in terms of kind of rhythm and urgency. It's also recruitment, it's warning, it's an attempt to kind of bolster people. And all of this is combined with truth claims in kind of various ways. The manifesto form predates the Communist Manifesto, but it can be quite hard to think about that, to relate to it, because the Communist Manifesto has become the kind of text of the manifesto form, because it did sort of simultaneously inherit but also transform the form of the manifesto. But I think in your formulation, you say rather than truth claims, and I would maybe want to slightly tweak that. I mean, for me, the key point about a manifesto is that it's doing all these things at once. And what that doesn't mean and should never mean is saying that it's beyond criticism. And there is a kind of bad faith way of relating to this, which is to say, anytime anyone levels a criticism, which is to say, yeah, well, it doesn't really mean that, it's doing a different thing. And that's obviously bullshit. But at the same time, it is what's true and what's interesting about any text, but particularly a performative text like this, is the way it's doing more than one thing at once, and sometimes with kind of contradictory pulls. And so there are certainly places where it does make if you like, a claim about the future, which my reading is that, it really is sort of arguing like this is the way things are going. And then there are other points where it's sort of saying, if we are not careful, this is the way things are going. And then there's other points where it's saying, if we do our job right, this is the way things are going. This isn't a counsel of despair, quite the opposite. This is to say that, part of the job of critical reading of any text is to be able to kind of tease those different weights apart and to sort of say, the criticism that the manifesto is wrong about X or Y has some traction in this case, if you read it generously, but in this other case, it's predicated on a misunderstanding of what this text is doing. And maybe in a third case, both are true. I don't think there's any contradiction between saying that a text is doing more than one thing. And you may say, well, it's right insofar as this, but it's wrong insofar as this. And there are various places in my discussion of the Communist Manifesto where I sort of try to say that. I try to say, Marx and Engels are saying two slightly contradictory things in the same sentence here. And it's our job to try and understand the weight between the two of them and to evaluate them. But the last thing I would say about this is, in case this all sounds very dry, one of the key points of a manifesto, as I say, is that it is performance, and it's performance which is designed in part to bring about what it is describing. So it's not the way it performs itself, the way it uses language is absolutely vital to its job of kind of sweeping up the passions, not at the expense of analytical rigor, but imbricated with it. And at a very simple level, that means one of the pleasures of reading the manifesto is that it's beautiful, it's remarkable. Whether one agrees or not with some of its claims and its positions, it is just a joy to read this kind of incantatory prose. And Marshall Berman obviously famously really stresses this, but this is something which even critics of Marx will often allow, that this is a remarkable piece of kind of almost apocalyptic literature.
Why? And this question will undoubtedly annoy some listeners, but I feel like sometimes there's a bit of an arms race over which more complex and obscure Marx text one is supposed to read to be counted as a true Marxist.
Yeah.
And, those are great texts too, but why should people read the Manifesto? And why do people read the Manifesto? Because I do think sometimes it's sort of, the real Marx heads there's sort of an implicit sense that it's like for college kids or something.
Yeah. Well, just to establish my bona fides among the Marx heads, let me start by saying that as a real Marx bro, my favorite volume of Capital is actually Capital Volume 2. So,
Oh shit.
Deep cut, right? So, and you're right, these are all remarkable volumes. I mean, I think there's various answers to why the Communist Manifesto is still worth reading, and worth reading even if you're, not just a crazy college kid. And I suppose, and these all overlap and work together, but there's a question of kind of intellectual and historical curiosity. This is arguably, and has been argued by many people, including enemies, the single most influential 12-ish thousand words written in history. And that's pretty amazing. So simply out of curiosity, I think it's worth looking at it. I think it's worth looking at it because, as I say, at its best, and there are some clunky bits, but at its best, it's an astounding piece of work. It's a beautiful thing to read. And also, the two other things that I think are foremost, I'm sure we could come up with more. One is that it does indeed still embed a certain set of positions politically, economically, but particularly politically and historically, I think, which are still incredibly powerful. And obviously, as a leftist, you could say, well, I would say that. But the thing is, that's to put it the wrong way around. I would say that because I read it and found it amazing, and it was one of the things that made me into a leftist. Not the only thing, but it is, I think, rightly an incredibly powerful text. And it is not just a museum piece. And I think that part of the job that I'm trying to say is to say that if you read it, certainly critically, but generously and thoughtfully, you may gain, as I did, a great deal more out of it politically and intellectually than you might think if you only think of it as a kind of introductory text. And the final of these reasons, I will say, because it became an increasingly important motivator to me in writing the book and rereading the manifesto, is because so much of the discussion around it is so utterly boneheaded and stupid, mostly from its critics, but I have to say I don't exonerate all of its supposed friends either. That, when it is approached like a piece of sacred writ, when it is approached, as you were saying, like as a series of truth claims, like a maths textbook, what you end up with are these very sort of swinging, either generally critiques or occasionally paeans of praise, which are just predicated on a kind of magisterial misunderstanding of what this book is and what it's doing. And so simply, I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which one of the motivations for reading the book, and maybe even my book, is a kind of epochal irritation with how stupid and needlessly stupid what could be an interesting and productive and inspiring conversation can be.
Let's set some historical context. The Manifesto was published in 1848 on the eve of these earth-shaking continent-wide revolutions, though certainly, to be clear, it was published too late to have any impact, real impact on them.
Yeah.
What was happening in the years and decades leading up to 1848 in the wake of these so-called dual revolutions, the political revolution in France and the industrial revolution in the UK and elsewhere? Because you write that the Manifesto spoke for this mass communist movement that did not yet exist in any real sense. You write, quote, "The hubris of speaking for communism as a potentially vast movement is breathtaking, and it would become essentially accurate."
Right. I mean, this is, in a way, you could say the magics of a manifesto is that it brings about what it claims is the case. And there is an argument that, seen from a certain lens, the Communist Manifesto helped to do that a great deal. Although I'm being slightly provocative here. I wouldn't say that as a document only it had this immense influence. Certainly not early on. Later it did. But the context was one of, as you say, the living memory of two enormous and sort of world historical revolutionary changes, one being the revolution in France, which also had, effects around the world, and the other being the more extended process of the Industrial Revolution and the kind of extraordinary change in relations of production, in the way the economies and the most advanced economies progressed, in the shape and nature of capitalism. So what you have is this kind of, accelerating capitalism, but you also have accelerating, I shouldn't say but, you see how ideologically interpolated I am. And you have this kind of accelerating process of class polarization. Around the 1840s, you have increasing immiseration of poor and working class people. I think it was sometimes called the Hungry 40s. And it was generally a time in which not only people on the left, plenty of perspicacious bourgeois and liberal figures were saying very explicitly, we are on the verge of a revolution. We are on the verge of a political catastrophe, as they would see it, or immense upheaval, that this cannot stand. And in that context, you've got the kind of larger mass working class movements, like the Chartists, most famously probably in England. But then within those, you have a kind of far left fringe who are developing ideas from, in various combinations, the very radical wing of the French Revolution, anti-hierarchical ideas from kind of liberation-oriented religious faiths, kind of utopian dreams of previous eras of socialists and so on. And at the time of writing, as Engels would later make clear, this kind of far left cluster called themselves communist as opposed to socialist, that socialists were essentially the kind of left wing of the kind of liberal middle classes, whereas the hard left of the working classes called themselves communists. Now, this distinction became much less important quite quickly afterwards. So quite later, you see Marx and Engels fairly happy to call themselves either, depending on context. But at the time of the manifesto, this was very determinedly a communist manifesto, as opposed to any other kind of reformist or critical position. And it was the voice, not even really of the far left of the workers' movement, it was the voice of a tiny sliver of the far left of a broader sort of working class current that was speaking as if it was the voice of an insurgent mass. And then Marx and Engels, in this kind of performative mode, they were commissioned by their comrades to basically lay out their positions. And they wrote this tract that was essentially designed to kind of speak as if it was the voice of the mass, and to act as a pole of attraction, and to assert certain things as almost fait accompli in a political movement, all on the eve, what turned out to be the eve of this incredible Europe-wide, but to a lesser degree worldwide, revolutionary moment. And, in terms of the impact that it could have had, one of the it's kind of bleakly amusing, which is that Marx always he was dreadful with deadlines. And as you say, this book appeared too late to really impact 1848 at all. By the time it came out, the crest was already on a downward trajectory. But in fact, it had been weeks that his comrades in the Communist League were saying, "Your book is late, put it out. And he, in the end, the last chapter is incredibly truncated. And there's something quite poignant and amazing about the fact that, so committed an activist as Marx because it was he who did the kind of the last draft, if you like, even the actually existing fact of an actual revolution around him in the world could not quite bring him to really meet his deadlines with a book that could have been designed to speak to this revolution happening at that moment. And this is the point at which one says something wryly about how all writers can identify with this.
It's the manifesto of the Communist Party, but we should note that that party here does not refer to a modern political party. There were not modern mass political parties as we would come to understand them at the time, and certainly no communist parties. It was a moment when communist and radical politics tended to take place in small clandestine societies, the sort of entity inspired by Blanqui or Babeuf, rather than these open, public, democratic mass organizations. What then did they mean by party?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And I think it's one of the points where one can misunderstand if one doesn't have a little bit of historical context. I mean, essentially, what it's doing is kind of saying the social force, the organized political force, the sort of self-conscious grouping, the current. And it wasn't too long before the word came to mean something much more like political parties as we would now understand them, to the point that my own suspicion is that there are already threads of that within the word as it's used. So if you like, it was making two different tendentious claims, which I would think of as wagers against the future. One was that it was saying, this is the voice and the position of this grouping of working class activists that is powerful and meaningful enough in the world to consider itself a party, in inverted commas, in that earlier sense, i.e., an actual political social force, which was not the case at the time, but that was more of a kind of a sort of urgent aspiration. And then I think there are also the sort of the germ seeds, if you like, of a slightly more modern iteration that kind of folds out from that, which is a kind of an organized grouping, but that's a little bit more distant at this point. My own feeling is that there's a degree of cheekiness to it, that Marx and Engels, they're trying to create facts on the ground by making these claims. These are two writers who are very good at deploying swagger. There are contexts in which political swagger, dissident swagger, can be an underrated tactical tool. And in the same way as within the pages of the manifesto, at various points, they talk to the bourgeoisie rather than to the workers in this kind of amazingly sort of vinegary way. They're sort of swaggering to sort of assert what they hope to be true or what they hope to become true, which is that they are speaking for a mass movement. And last point on this, it's worth bearing in mind that they had just essentially won a political battle within the Communist League about its direction. And they had moved it in a much more, in a sense, a less kind of quasi-religious moralist mode into something more akin to what we would now think of as kind of, Marxist socialism, moving away from sort of like, we must do this because of the brotherhood of man, as they would have said, and more to do with, historical dynamics and tendencies of economics and politics. And so I think declaring this the Manifesto of the Communist Party is also a kind of rolling over of that, in a way kind of flushed from the success of having kind of won over this position, this group to their position. In a way, they're kind of trying to do that with this document on more of a mass scale.
Let's turn to the text, starting from the beginning. Marx and Engels write, quote, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies." They continue, noting that everyone is trying to red bait, tarring political enemies as communists even when they're not, something that's really remarkably contemporary feeling. And then they continue, quote, "It's high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself." Why start by invoking the specter, mocking their enemies, and reveling in their fear in the way that they do?
Yeah, it's an incredibly fecund and strange beginning. And as you say, I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, talk about history repeating itself. It's, first as tragedy, then as farce, now as I don't know, very degraded reality TV. But exactly, I mean, what they're doing is they're doing several different things at once. And one of the things they do is they're diagnosing this fact of red baiting as a kind of go-to attack of the right, and that their enemies, their class enemies, and the reactionaries and the bourgeoisie are kind of throwing around this accusation and talking about how terrifying this is and how this has to be nipped in the bud. And one of the things that Marx and Engels are doing is mocking them for this. They're saying essentially these people are telling nursery stories. They're telling a horror story, like a kind of like a scary fairy tale, because they're so ridiculous. But then they do this amazing switchback, which is, having essentially teased them, mocked them for this over dramatization, they then sort of take it seriously and sort of speak as the hobgoblin, which they've already mocked as an imaginary creature. And then they're like, okay, so as that spectre, or as Helen Macfarlane, the first translator of the Manifesto into English, put it, as the frightful hobgoblin, we will now tell you what in fact our position is. So they go from sort of saying they're invoking this imaginary thing to saying this thing is real, but they're misrepresenting it. So speaking as that thing, we will now tell you what we think. I think this is where, you've mentioned it yourself, the Manifesto form is so rich, because they get to mock their enemies as being kind of hyperbolic and ridiculous. And then they also get to kind of switch around and use their own terms against them, all as a kind of rhetorically scintillating way into laying out their political propositions. And of course, as there is now I was going to say a cottage industry, but it's more like a townhouse industry now in kind of talking about ghosts in the Manifesto, largely because of Derrida's Spectres of Marx. And I do think that whole kind of project of looking at the Manifesto and Marxism in general in a kind of Gothic mode is interesting. But maybe as someone who, writes and reads and loves kind of science fiction and horror and so on, one of the things I'm always careful about is essentially surrendering to fan service for myself. So I would love nothing more than to just talk about ghost stories all day. And for that very reason, I am sometimes a bit skeptical of some of the kind of exaggerated fascination with the quote hauntology unquote in Marx. I'm certainly not saying there's not a there, but I'm saying, this is a component, but let's not over exaggerate it. Let's talk about it in terms of other things as well, and so on. And certainly in the comments,
they were having some fun there.
They were having some great fun.
You could only read so much into that.
Absolutely. I mean, Marx, you talk about them having fun. Among various other things, these guys are trolls, and we have to relate to that.
They would have known how to post.
It is to my constant delight that they do not live in an era of social media, because I think it would be utterly catastrophic, and they would be cancelled so many times, and they would shitpost, and they would waste their time. But it is true that they are trolls of the left, among other things. Let me be very clear. And when they get into that mode, they're really good at it, and they have a great time. And it's hard not to be swept up in that as a reader.
Let's turn to the Manifesto's theory of history. Quote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." Marx and Engels don't mean that there's been this constant self-conscious class conflict throughout all time. What then do they mean? And why is it so important for them to state this theory of history, to lay it out right at the beginning?
I mean, I think you're right. And you've also pointed out something really important, which is they nowhere say that this means, at every moment of history, different classes have been at daggers drawn with a conscious sense of opposition. And this is important to say, because one of the common criticisms of the Manifesto, frankly, of Marxism in general, but certainly of the Manifesto, is that, Marx and Engels say that class struggle has always been there. And in actual fact, look, the classes on the whole get along fine. There's lots of cooperation. And this is just such a stupid reading that I find it very frustrating. And you see it from writers who should really know better. You see it from, critics of Marx who are not stupid, but for some reason it's very important to them to kind of read this particular kind of claim in a very reductive way. What they're saying is that from epochs ago, the dynamic shape of history has been sort of pushed forward at a fundamental level by the relations between those who have power over the productive resources of a society and the distribution that follows from them, and those who do not have power over those things, those decisions, that distribution, and who in most cases are actually, doing the work to use those resources at the instruction, one way or the other, however mediatedly, of the ruling class. And that is a claim about the nature of history, not just in capitalism, but in any non-radically egalitarian society, essentially, non-systemically egalitarian society. And it's interesting that later on, when they're commenting on the manifesto later on, and they're sort of saying, well, this is a historical claim that no longer holds water, ignore this bit, and so on and so forth. One of the things that they stress is like the key contribution that stands the test of time is essentially this theory of history. So from that stem a whole lot of other things about class interests and about how much change and amelioration of a situation can come from within an existing organization of society on that class basis and so on. So they start not with a criticism of capitalism, but with a claim about the nature of history. And then they talk about the specific shape that historical tendency is taking under capitalism.
And they specifically zero in on how that sort of class conflict motor of history pushes these more epical shifts from one mode of production to another, and specifically how feudalism transitioned to capitalism. Quote, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, the feudal relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. What's this contradiction between, I guess, the relations of property and the organization of production that they're identifying as causing this shift? And then where would Marx and Engels have fit into contemporary debates over the transition to capitalism?
This is such a vast question, whether or not one can, as a Marxist or indeed in any other way, talk meaningfully and usefully about a mode of production and the relationship between that and political upheaval and revolution. And it's important to say, I should say, that within the context of the manifesto, which is a very short, very polemical, very performative document, I think it would be unfair and unrealistic to say that they kind of lay out a systematic theory of this here. But certainly what they gesture towards is these structures of societies aren't just thrown up willy-nilly. They're thrown up because of certain relations of class forces. To some extent, in mediated ways, those at the top of society, the ruling class, are gaining certain key benefits from the decisions that they are making that the other people can't make about what to do with the productive resources of society. So this is all predicated very firmly on a kind of and indeed anti-democracy. And so when they talk about bursting the fetters of the old mode and so on, I mean, what they're essentially saying is that history and productive technology and so on are not static, and they change. And as you accumulate more and more stuff and more resources, and you put them into doing the same sort of job as they have been doing previously within this society, there reaches a point where the very organization of that society is in a certain tension with the tendencies of the productive resources itself. This is a highly contested claim in various different ways, but that one of the natures of their claim, particularly here, is that this isn't merely a kind of ethical position that they're taking. I mean, Miéville doing a lot of work there. I'm sure we'll talk about ethics later. But they're not saying that we need to change things, or indeed that feudalism had to change to capitalism or whatever, because it's a better system, because it's nicer for people. And that's the only reason. What they're saying is that the way the culture, the way the society had been set up has actually become a kind of a brake and a fetter and pulling back on the capacities that very society had put forward. And so there's an internal struggle. And because of the people who've made the decisions, who've set up this society, definitionally, their class interests are opposed to fundamentally changing this system, because it literally exists because they were in control of it, which means that they find themselves in many cases kind of opposed to the overthrow and the rupture that the social forces and the productive forces are pushing towards. And this is why it isn't the aristocracy that overthrow feudalism, because feudalism was doing a particular job for them. It's a different class, or under the leadership of a different class, that has a different relationship to these productive forces, which are now being constrained by the very system that originally sort of, set in motion the forces that got us here.
You know that the manifesto is remarkably full of praise for the bourgeoisie, given that it is, after all, a communist and thus anti-bourgeois manifesto. They write, quote, "The bourgeoisie, historically, has played a most revolutionary part. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. All fixed, fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind." These are really, I think, probably the most evocative and powerful passages in the whole manifesto. Is this praise essentially for capitalism's economic dynamism, these productive forces that the bourgeoisie has unleashed, forces that at present immiserate, but under communism would liberate? Marx and Engels mock and threaten the bourgeoisie, but they're also just so in awe of them.
It's a really excellent way of posing the question. And the passage you read is, as you say, probably not just the most evocative, but to my money, the most beautiful and the most well-known passage in the manifesto. And it is fairly frequently observed that when people first read the manifesto, if they don't know much about it, one of the most extraordinary things about it is how fulsomely and repeatedly Marx and Engels praise the bourgeoisie and have this kind of almost religious awe of its achievements. As you know, if you've read my book, I mean, this is something I wrestle with, because I don't mean like, I'm torn about this, because I think, broadly speaking, you are right that this is about, about a kind of an almost ecstatic amazement at the achievements of what you could loosely call capitalist society. And, remembering the milieu in which these guys were growing up and the living memory of the early industrial revolution and the changes that had been wrought and so on. I mean, you really are talking about, absolutely planet-shaking changes. And I think to some extent they are focusing on that and relating to that. And I think it goes a little deeper as well. I mean, I think they're kind of both exhilarated and sort of discombobulated by this sense of rush and this sense, something that I would talk about as a way of experiencing capitalist civilization. That when they invoke this pell-mell sense of rush, and they do see this as both liberating and also atomizing, and they're pretty clear about that. Now, all of that said, it is also my contention that there are certainly places within the manifesto where they do tie this into, if you like, an unearned appreciation for the bourgeoisie itself as a class and as a group of people. And my own hunch and contention is that had Marx and Engels written this document 6 months later, a lot of this praise would have been far less fulsome and far more specifically about the epochal changes of capitalist civilization rather than the bourgeoisie, because one of the key things that 1848 taught them brutally is that the bourgeoisie as a class, one is not necessarily talking here about individuals, as a class and as an organized social force, will always take the side of reaction against radical change. under capitalism, always, and will always stab the working class in the back. Now, some of its members may do so with tears, some of them may regret it, but the point is, as an organized force, it will always do this. And I think Marx and Engels had this notion that, like, what they wanted was the bourgeoisie to be kind of Promethean heroes and usher in a truly liberal democracy that would allow more space for the kind of the radical left and the working class movement. And what they learned was that this wouldn't happen. This won't happen. And so there's a paradox, which is that this seminal document of communism is actually the last gasp of an excessive optimism and admiration for the bourgeoisie as a class. Now, I would probably go further and say that although I love the terminology and the way of writing, even as a relationship to capitalist civilization in a broader sense, while it's very powerful in terms of diagnosing the lived experience of living under capitalism, particularly kind of early capitalism, I think it does underplay, if you like, the other side of things. And they didn't talk very much in these early stages, not enough and not systemically enough about imperialism and about sort of the extractive nature. I mean, they certainly talk about it. It's a canard to say they don't, but I do think it's fair to say that in certain respects, it's not integrated into their theory as well as it would come to be and as well as one might like it to be. But particularly when one's talking about the bourgeoisie as a class, I think there's almost something tragic to me as an admirer of Marx and Engels reading this document, because what you're reading is the words of two people who are about to get their hearts broken.
They write that a key feature of capitalism is that, quote, what the bourgeoisie produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. And I think what's key here is that they emphasize that it will be the self-activity of the proletariat, of the oppressed, as it comes into collective consciousness of its position and historical role. It will be that force that overthrows the capitalist mode of production. And this is a major distinction they draw against other currents of socialism. And there are obviously questions to ask here about this presumed inevitability, big questions. But I think what's more interesting, maybe, is that Marx and Engels see it as so critical to identify the proletariat as not only the beneficiaries of the coming communist revolution, but also as necessarily its protagonists. What do you make of that? Why is it the self-activity of the proletariat that's so key for them?
It's important to say, having stressed how much they're full of praise for the bourgeoisie, that they're also full of, they're full of piss and vinegar about them, and they're hardly, unremitting fans. But as you say, their vision of change is predicated on the self-activity of the working class. And I would say that they do allow, by the way, related to this, they do allow in the manifesto, in a way that I don't recall them doing in any other document, that like individual members of the bourgeoisie or other classes may come to see the necessity of, working class revolution.
It's a little autobiographical for Engels there.
Oh my God, so much. Yeah, the anxiety of class position is really obvious. I mean, they only do that as an aside, and I think you're right that they are doing this partly out of a kind of sense of nervousness about their own selves. Not nervousness exactly, but a sense of their own position. But I think it's an interesting aside because it does stress that what we're talking about here are organized currents. And so on the one hand, there's like a negative and a positive. And the negative is that the bourgeoisie as the ruling class, as an organized current, or even a disorganized but class united current, cannot overthrow capitalism, cannot even ameliorate it beyond certain very, very limited forms, because they are a class defined by their exploitive relationship to another class within this system, which is the system that, among other things, replicates their class power. So there is a sort of negative sense, which is, you're on a hiding to nothing if you say that the way that you want to change society is to basically appeal to the better nature of the bourgeoisie, because the system doesn't give a damn about their better nature. The system is predicated on a certain way of arranging resources and resource management. And to fundamentally change that would be to fundamentally kind of eradicate the fact of a bourgeoisie at all. So it's just a logical fallacy from them. And then in terms of the focus on the workers' self-activity, this has nothing to do with saying that this is because workers are, or the working class, I should say, are better people. It has nothing to do with saying, democracy would be nice or anything like this. What it's about saying is that if you see the ills of society as basically kind of most of them as kind of concomitant on this way of organizing production for profit rather than for human need, and for profit that is in the control of a certain small group, then there's a certain sort of definitional way, which is to move beyond that to a society which turns these resources to human need rather than profit. That sense of being organized at a grassroots level, where the production and the distribution are decided by the very people who are doing it, that's not a nice to have. That's literally definitional to where you are going. Because, how can you organize for need unless you have the people who need the things being the people who are telling you what is needed? And if they're telling you what is needed, they're essentially making the decisions. So this is the positive aspect of radical grassroots democracy. And it's been pointed out by many people on whose shoulders I stand, that communism is not about the eradication of democracy. Communism worthy of the name, let's say, is not about the eradication of democracy, but an incredible flowering of it at a much more systemic level. And I think that's important because, well, for various reasons, but one of them is that there are currents of leftism, some very well-intentioned, some completely sincere, which essentially have this notion that what you can do is you can kind of, with a small minority or with a well-thinking but small radical group, you can kind of organize society such that you've moved beyond capitalism and towards something that you can call communism worthy of the name. Now, we can debate what kind of societies you can create like that. Okay, but let's shelve that for the moment. But within the model of the manifesto, what that cannot be is communism, definitionally. And this is where my variably comradely argument with certain traditions of, socialism from above or non-socialism from below would stem. That this isn't just about a kind of left populist rah-rah. It's about a rigorous relationship to an organized mode of production and society called communism, and how it has to be itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, entirely. It's not just an ethical principle, but it is that too.
Yeah. Whatever Marx and Engels may have thought.
Right. They describe how capitalism remakes class relations and really makes class. Quote, "Our epic, the epic of the bourgeoisie, possesses this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat." And they suggest perhaps, though I think, you unpack this a bit, that other classes gradually disappear, or at least become less relevant. And this was a moment, I think it's important to emphasize, that the vast majority of even Europe's population remained rural, let alone the rest of the world. What did they see taking shape at the time? And to what extent were they right? Could they foresee, for example, the rise of all these sorts of intermediary class forces, such as professionals and managers in the 20th century, or the progressive differentiation of the proletariat by gender, race, nationality, educational and immigration status, housing, and, so many different factors? Because I think a key lesson from the 19th and early 20th century seems to be that industrialization alone does not make for the entirety of class formation. It requires politics and organizations too. Is there a more dialectical way to make sense of Marx and Engels' analysis of class formation here that points to the ways that the working classes is both made and unmade in all these various ways, perhaps more contingent ways over time?
These passages are one of the ways in which some critics criticize the manifesto, that claim about, the two great classes is fairly regularly interpreted as saying that, as you towards which you gesture, that, the other classes will disappear. As generally stated, this is a bullshit criticism that is not supported by the text. And again, most of those who level it should really know better. It's very lazy reading at best, because the fact is, within the text itself, it also talks about other classes. It also talks about other classes and people thrown into different class positions and so on. It talks about the petty bourgeoisie and so on and so forth. So nowhere in the text do Marx and Engels either say or, in my opinion, mean that what you're doing is you're eradicating all the intermediary classes, all the other classes, and what you end up with under, quote, pure capitalism, which is a chimera, is just the bourgeoisie and the proletarians. They don't say it, they don't think it, they don't mean it. What they are getting at, I think fairly clearly, is that these are, if you like, increasingly powerful centers of gravity. And that therefore all the other activity that takes place within a society, including class activity of other classes, will increasingly be determined by the wrangling of these two gravitational forces. And so if you are a member of the petty bourgeoisie, or you are, a kind of surviving aristocrat, or you whatever, what you can do, what you choose to do, your field of operations and the pulls on you are going to be increasingly defined by what is a much more fundamental systemic dynamic within this society, which is that pole of opposition. That's what they're talking about. And when they talk about other classes and the dynamics of other classes, like when they talk about members of the bourgeoisie, coming over to the side of the workers, when they talk about the social pressures on the petty bourgeoisie and what it might lead them to do, they are talking about in the context of this fundamental opposition of gravitational pulls. So that's what they're talking about. So when people say, well, we have loads of other classes now, so Marx and Engels are wrong, this is not really a criticism worthy of the interlocutor. Now, in the context of a situation in which you still have a very large rural population,
like 80% of Europe or something at that time, of most European countries,
overwhelming, and for many, the majority of whom would still be experiencing life in a way that would be essentially pretty recognizable to a feudal peasant in many cases. And so to some extent, what they're talking about here is they're making a prediction based on their read of the class dynamics about what's going to happen in terms of the relationship of people on the land to productive capitalism, the diminution of the peasantry, both in terms of numbers, but also in terms of as a social force, and the pull of those groups within the field of the bourgeoisie proletarian opposition. So they're talking about that, and on those terms, I think they're fairly trivially obviously correct. Now, what I do think is true is that I think you have to be able to distinguish what the manifesto says and the underlying philosophy and positions of the manifesto, and what Marx and Engels might have expected. Now, my hunch is that Marx and Engels would be astonished and probably pretty appalled in most cases by, among other things, precisely as you say, the proliferation of these people with, what Eric Olin Wright called contradictory class positions, and these, the PMCs, and and these endless debates about what exactly is the class position of a working class person who owns shares in this company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and all the intermediary levels of managerial specialists and so on. So I think it is true that, like, one of the many things that Marx and Engels probably underestimated as activists themselves was the space for that proliferation of intermediaries and other classes. But the fundamental dynamic that they identified, for my money, remains not just persuasive, but indispensable, because the point is that all of those other groups, important as they are, meaningful as they are, humans as they are, and we need to understand the impact this has on people's lives, all of their relationship to society is predicated, I think, on that pull between those in charge, who are the ruling class, who are, making the decisions at an aggregate level about the production and distribution in society, and those who are doing the work for them and who are producing the profit without any control over it, that is the reason for the system pursuing. So that fundamental dynamic remains as strong as ever. And in a sense, if all you focus on is the fact of other classes, you're not doing anything. You're doing the most kind of snapshot kind of vulgar sociology. But once you start to say, how do these classes work? To what ends? For what purposes? With what tendencies, I don't think you can do that without identifying a fundamental class opposition under capitalism. And that's why I think whatever the intentions and beliefs of the authors, I think the actual philosophical claims made and historical claims made hold water very rigorously.
They argue that the capitalist mode of production tends toward a particular form of crisis, one that ultimately lays the groundwork for its overthrow. Quote, in these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in earlier epochs, would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. These crises are then provisionally resolved, quote, on the one hand by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, on the other by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. What is overproduction? And were Marx and Engels correct to diagnose this as capitalism's signal crisis tendency, or has the long sweep of capitalist history over the past century and 3/4 since they wrote this, has it revealed that other forms of crisis are also at play?
Yeah. What they are trying to identify is tendencies, and tendencies over the long durée. So to merely point at something that doesn't fit this model and say this exists, therefore they're wrong, would be silly. You've got to look at at an aggregate level. It's also important, I think, to caveat that the economic theories embedded in the manifesto are probably the least developed of the things that it does. So there certainly are economic positions and theories in the manifesto, but I think they need more teasing apart, and they can more fruitfully be built up with other things that they said elsewhere to get a full picture than the question of history, the question of politics. And B, this is also some of the areas in which I think one can relatively uncontroversially, even from within the left, say, okay, well, they were wrong about this. For example, famously, they talk about the absolute immiseration of the worker, the idea that things are just going to get worse and worse on an absolute level, which even they themselves disputed later, and which I would stress as an aside, they dispute within their own text of the manifesto, although they don't fully seem to realize they're doing it. And I mention this because, again, this is where sometimes, as with any text, we need to be able to deploy the text against itself and identify the fundamental philosophies within it. Now, what you're talking about is this kind of paradox, which, to put it very simply, under, for example, feudalism, an economic crisis would probably manifest as, we have a certain number of goods and we don't have enough of them for everyone who wants them. This is to simplify to a point that would make a historian scream, no doubt, but within the time available. Broadly speaking, this is their claim. Under capitalism, what you have rather is too many goods to make a viable profit on of a certain type, a crisis of overproduction. And as this economic theory gets fleshed out, you also end up with kind of related inextricable problems, such as, too many goods, an overproduction of goods that people need, but that they can't buy because they don't have enough money. And I think, funnily enough, once you start thinking of it like that, it feels much less paradoxical, because that is a situation we see all around us every day, because we live in an unbelievably debased reality. It is one of the most common things in the world for people to die of hunger in markets where there is a grain surplus because they don't have enough money. So in a sense, there's a combination of two phenomena, I should say. The reason that things are produced under capitalism is not because they're needed, it's because they make a profit. Now, if no one needed any of them, they would never make a profit. So this isn't saying that they're random, but it is saying if it's more profitable to make, torture instruments than to make baby formula, then the logic of capitalism is to make as many torture instruments as possible, irrespective of what the individual capitalists think. Some of them may decry this situation, but the logic of the system is profit maximization, and that means that you will get more torture instruments than baby formula, and then you will reach a point where there are so many torture instruments that there's a glut, and even the people who enthusiastically want to torture their enemies can't afford to sweep them all up. And, oh, by the way, we haven't produced enough baby formula. Okay, so if you like, a crisis of insufficient commodities of a particular type is always inextricable from a crisis of overproduction in another sector. And on a kind of localized level, what this also means is what you're talking about is you're never talking under capitalism about a lack of demand. What you're talking about is a lack of effective demand. And effective demand means demand backed up with the money to buy the goods. And that's why you can end up with grain ships throwing their silos overboard because the price is too low to bother going to the next port, at the same time as people within a day's drive of the next port are dying of starvation. And it says something about what's happened to us as human beings, that this is a widely known reality, and that somehow this is still deemed to be a society that is viable.
Yeah, and this is not an insight, as I think you just suggested with your remark about effective demand, that's unique to Marx. It's the sort of thing that Keynes was looking at as well.
Yeah, and every time there's an economic crisis, in which will be manifested by people, dying, suffering these exact situations and pilings up of surplus in some areas that are rotting, which then means the collapse of other industries, which means you're then not getting production of other things, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that happens regular as clockwork every time there is an economic crisis is that a section of mainstream, if you like, bourgeois economics, generally liberal, but sometimes even right-wing, will sort of delightfully try to scandalize its followers by saying, in fact, we can learn quite a bit here from Karl Marx. And there's this utterly tedious return to Marx that happens every few years because the crises return every few years. And then the more far-sighted or perspicacious or indeed edgelord wing of mainstream economics will point out that this is hardly news.
I'm Aziz Rana, and you're listening to The Dig, a great place for analysis about where we are, how we got here, and what can be done. It's my favorite podcast, and you can support it at patreon.com.
This episode, like every episode of The Dig, is made possible thanks to our listeners who support us at patreon.com and is produced in partnership with Jacobin Magazine. Jacobin is an incredible publication. You've probably seen a lot of what they've published online, but they also have a beautiful print magazine. It comes out quarterly and is well over 100 pages, packed with illustrations, infographics, and some of the best graphic design in the country. Dig listeners can join 70,000 Jacobin subscribers, developing socialist political thought and debate for just $15 a year. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's entire back catalog. If you've never subscribed to Jacobin before, you can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin. There's a link in the show notes. Click it. According to the manifesto, this process of crisis and provisional resolution ultimately leads to some sort of breaking point. Quote, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. Did Marx and Engels fail to see how many provisional resolutions capitalism would manage to conjure up over time? Or maybe is it too soon to tell?
Yeah, give it another 300-400 years. We'll see. No, I mean, I think they did. But again, let's distinguish between what they thought, what they said, and what they said meant. Okay, we have to be able to tease these apart. Now, I don't think it's controversial. In fact, it's been a mainstay of a lot of the socialist movement. Perhaps most famously, Trotsky said this 90 years after the Manifesto, that Marx and Engels would be astonished and appalled by the adaptability of capitalism. And if there's one thing that I think, we on the left have to really, really take into our souls, it is quite how adaptable capitalism is. And I think tragically, it is eminently possible that capitalism can and will adapt itself to death, by which I mean the death of it and everyone else. I don't think this is controversial. Well, it's clearly controversial, but it's not controversial to me among me. Now, the manifesto itself is interestingly it's contradictory on this because they are often accused of being what some people call inevitabilist and basically saying that certain things will definitely happen. There is, I think, a traditional leftist defense of them, which is to say, no, they don't say that these things will definitely happen. I don't think that's I don't think that's true. I think there are certain things they did definitely say will definitely happen, which didn't happen. What's interesting, though, is that they also said within the same text, they might not happen. And again, they may not have realized this, but they did. So you have, for example, repeated references to like the inevitable victory of the proletarians, producing its own gravediggers, the victory is inevitable, etc. And this is pretty clear. And I think it takes quite a lot of gymnastics to pretend that they're not making those claims. But within the same text, they then say that, you know, one of the outcomes of like a struggle between classes can be the mutual ruination of the contending classes. You can end up with a catastrophe in which no one comes out on top. And then I would go further and say that within their very exhortations, within the very kind of eagerness and urgency of the tenor in which they make their writing, there is an implicit sense that this is a deeply, deeply important job. They're desperately trying to recruit people to this. And if you see it as straightforwardly inevitable, why are you bothering to recruit people? It just doesn't follow. This isn't an attempt to exonerate them from criticism. It's to say that there's a contradiction here. And I think that everything in the manifesto, in the way they talk to their working class readers, says that they are desperate for them to get on board. And part of the reason they're desperate for them to get on board is because they're not at all sure it's all going to be okay. Even as in other parts, they clearly do think that the victory is inevitable. As an aside, I don't think this kind of contradiction is unique. I think you find it in loads and loads of texts. That's fine. That's part of the job of a critical reader. But I think they were, if you like, excessively optimistic about the way that once you reach a certain point at which capitalism is, the property relations of capitalism are standing in the way of the productive capacities of capitalism, which for me would include the capacities culturally and spiritually and in terms of all other spheres, not merely in terms of the production of stuff. There is a sense for them that once you've reached that point, there's a certain inevitability that it's going to be overthrown.
In a political and ideological sense as well,
right?
I think, because like one key piece of their inevitablest argument is that this virtue of capitalism is that it's rendered all these forms of oppression, hierarchy, and domination just stark and clear, and thus prone to being delegitimized and revolted against. They write, quote, "The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions. It has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation." And there is, on one level, there is an aspect of capitalism that's like this, but on the other, they didn't seem to take account of this coming role to be played by new and powerful superstructures of the sort of ideologies that Gramsci identified, forces that would mystify and re-legitimize capitalism again and again. But perhaps they really didn't exist in that way at the time. And what they really were seeing before them was just this kind of demystifying process underway.
Yeah, I mean, I think as with so much in the manifesto, what they identify with a kind of polemical, and it's worth restating, with a polemical and performative formulation is a real tendency. And there is a real tendency. We have indeed seen at various points over history, old school, certain kinds of patriarchal, traditional authorities overthrown by the cash nexus. And even within societies or places where they aren't, which in other words is everywhere in the world in various ways, there are times and contexts in which that becomes much clearer, and the sort of, if you like, the primacy of the cash nexus will assert itself in many cases. But what they don't, I think, do is integrate the extent to which the tenacity of some of these either pre-existing or different tendencies of differentiation, and B, and I think this is crucial, the way they intersect with the dynamics and the class dynamics and the power dynamics within capitalism. In some cases, this is entirely cynical and conscious, as in the deployment of racism, for example, by ruling classes as a way to keep workers on side in certain contexts. But it's also perfectly possible that some of the people kind of, this doesn't have to be a kind of cynical decision. These can be completely, maybe not good faith, but sincere beliefs, but that are nonetheless able to sustain themselves because they are operating within a certain kind of ideological niche within capitalism with its underlying gravitational pulls. And so what they see as capitalism's almost like its capacity to act like historical and social bleach and just kind of efface everything is actually more like a kind of reagent. And it has a fundamental dynamic. And that dynamic is always there, but that some of these other dynamics will continue to operate, but in new ways on that fundamental dynamic. And I do think they underestimate this. I don't, to any extent, think that this is something that can't be brought within the purview of their system and within the purview that the manifesto lays out. But I do think it's fair to say that they have a much too one-sided vision of capitalism as a kind of flattening. The one thing I would say, and I'm not trying to pick any fights here, but what you say about the newer ideological apparatuses and so on, and you mentioned Gramsci. Now, I 100% agree with that. And I think that it is important to say that, one of the things they underestimated, I think, is the power of ideology and the power of the ideological apparatuses. And in eras of mass media and social media and so on, these take on very dramatic new forms. And I think that is a really, really key thing here. There is also an interesting discussion to be had here at a much wider historical level, which isn't capitalist specific necessarily, which is why do certain of these ideological things work in the ways they do? Why do they work on human beings? Now, I don't get my knickers in a twist about this. I don't think this is a crisis that we need to give up all hope about. But when people sort of say, for example, well, the mass media, the right-wing media, whip up demonization of immigrants, okay, or trans people or whatever. Now, clearly, yes, they do. It's true. It doesn't follow automatically, like, why would that work? Why does it work? And of course, there are loads of people out there doing incredibly good work to sort of pick apart the chains of logic and the chains of political antagonism and the chains of interest and so on that mean why these individual things work in these particular circumstances. But I do still think sometimes there's a kind of an unanswered question about the way human beings relate in certain fundamental ways. So, when you look back to, was it in Byzantium where they had the chariot races of blue and Greece? I always forget which city it was. I think it was in Byzantium.
Sounds plausible.
Yeah, I mean, loads of people are screaming at the radio right now, or their podcast app right now. But long pre-capitalism, hundreds, thousands of years ago, and you've got like these kind of competitive chariot races with various teams identified by colors, and these became, dynamics that led to like riots and deaths and people killing each other because of their, it's kind of like a sort of proto football hooliganism thing, Right. Now, again, there is a certain right-wing argument which says, well, that happened, therefore socialism won't work. I am not that guy, and I'm not saying that. What I am saying is, it is surely of interest about, the nature of humanity that these semi-autonomously thrown up situations can lead to this kind of violent agonism, within and against different groups and so on. Absolutely I'm not at all saying like, racism is inevitable or anything like that. What I am saying is I do still think we have work to do to understand the ways that to put it tendentiously, the human soul acts in certain different historical contexts and so on, and under certain political pressures.
The sort of questions that anthropologists might try to answer, perhaps.
Anthropologists, psychoanalysts with a historical bent, theologians from whom I'm learning increasing amounts, and to me, this is a way of underlining what you're saying, that these technologies and so on do in a very particular capitalist way an exaggerated, hypostasized, and dramatically accelerated version of certain things that have happened in various different contexts. but now with a new class dynamic behind them, and a dynamic that leads to increasing exploitation and oppression.
Along those lines, Marx and Engels write, quote, "Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use, according to their age and sex." Speaking of reading the text against itself, those two sentences side by side have, I think, an incredibly productive tension. And they don't address race here, though it is addressed in other works. But does this analysis point to something important about the way that classes lived under capitalism, where in terms of sex or race or other social forms, in that these forms of difference are under capitalism simultaneously flattened into a money relation, like a labor widget, and also, at least implicitly here, this is where the tension comes in, intensified. The difference is intensified through that very same flattening process.
Yes, I think that's beautifully put, and I think you're 100% right. I mean, it's one of the most remarkable sections, and it is not true to say, as some people would say, that like race and gender, for example, are lacunae which are just not addressed in the manifesto. Flatly false. What is true is that the observations are not systemically integrated into the theory that is being developed. And that's a shame, because not because it would have proved the theory wrong, but because I think it would have enriched the theory that is laid out in incomplete form. And this is the difference between the kind of add and stir model, add gender and stir to class politics and class analysis, and, and a more constitutive and systematic model. So that this isn't a question of adding gender to class. It is, as I try and say in the book, it's a question of gender and class. And not just because you're saying, according to some kind of obligatory checklist of graduate school, well, I have to mention the following axes of oppression, but because some of these axes of oppression are, literally systemically having an impact on the fundamental dynamics at play and how they are experienced and how they replicate themselves. So as you say, in the case of gender, you have them saying capitalism sort of eradicates differences of gender, and then mentioning that like different workers get paid differently depending on their gender. And what workers get paid is a key constituent of their entire theory, the labor theory of value that they later, which is kind of present in nascent form, but then gets developed later on in other works. And so if you're saying that this is, that gender is part of this, then what you're actually saying is not only, well, gender and race and other axes of oppression can be, what's the quote, the modalities by which classes lived, which they are also, but they are constitutive of all of those categories such as surplus value at the level of the systemic replication of the system itself. So it's not just a question of saying, well, we're going to integrate these things because they give us a more nuanced understanding of the way people live in class society and experience class society. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's an important thing to do. But it's not only that, it's also about saying, and beyond that, it's going to give us a more rigorous and a better understanding of the way that class society works and replicates itself and makes it profit and distributes its profit. And this is what, one of the things that's very frustrating sometimes about the debates on the left between, to use grossly, unhelpful forms that, kind of class first. I've got scare quotes up for the listeners, class first Marxism versus intersectional Marxism, is that I think sometimes if you allow that these modalities are in fact experience, you can sort of say, well, sure, but I'm not talking about experience. I'm talking about the fundamental dynamics of capitalism itself. And this other stuff is for kind of sociology or psychology or whatever. But I'm talking about, I'm interested in Marx.
The laws of motion.
Right. The point is, if you approach this without the add and stir model, if you actually approach it the way, to be clear, as you pointed out, it is indicated within the Communist Manifesto itself, those laws of motion on which you peg such, Marx Bro credentials are indeed raced and gendered as part of being class. And that's the point about a nuanced understanding of class. It's not just that you're not just adding things, you're understanding class and class society better, including those laws of motion, I would say.
Yeah, it's simultaneously about the social and economic reality of capitalism, and it turns out they're inextricable because the ideological alibi for capitalism, race, sex, gender, whatever, nationality, it also fundamentally structures capitalism in as an economic system.
And as capitalism does with so many things, what it does is it either creates or in a lot of cases sort of inherits a set of oppressions or whatever. And then even if on a surface experience level, it leaves them almost exactly the same, which it rarely does, but even if it does, by virtue of doing that in a different systemic context, it's doing a fundamentally different systemic thing. The replication of the same in a new context is not the same.
People who haven't read the manifesto, or perhaps who haven't read it since their youth, might be surprised by how much is dedicated to the question of the family. Quote, "The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation." End quote. Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians, and in public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. What's being argued here? Because they write that the proletarianization of working class women and children means that no such hallowed family form exists among the working class. They do not see the bourgeois family as something to be emulated and universalized, as some sort of like trad normie socialists might believe. Indeed, they assert that the bourgeois family will be abolished alongside capitalism. So what is the family for Marx and Engels? And what does it reveal about their theorization of sex, sexuality, and kinship under capitalism? And I should add that there is a rather trolling and hard for me to parse line about free love that I think, may relate to this general argument.
I mean, it's very difficult to tell the extent to which they really mean this. Like, one of the things they mean, and I think this is perfectly true and reasonable, is what they're saying with that is they're saying, capitalism doesn't give you any space to breathe. Capitalism doesn't give you any space to love each other in the way that you deserve to be loved and the way you deserve to love it. Everyone who has got up on a Monday morning and wants to spend the day with their kids or their partner or their partners or whatever, and is like, I got to go to fucking work. Like, at one level, this is what they're saying. Now, honestly, I think that the distinction between the bourgeois family and the working class family here is exaggerated partly for kind of polemical effect. But what makes it really interesting to me is, in a way, much more so than any other tendency they identify in the manifesto. Mostly in the manifesto, what they identify is like, this is the new reality that capitalism lays bare. When they're talking about the family, particularly the bourgeois family, they actually do something different. And what they do is they say, we are now in an era of systemic hypocrisy. We're in an era in which the claims that are made are systematically broken at every point. That you make a claim about, fidelity and monogamy and so on, and then you have widespread prostitution and bed hopping. They have this thing about the bourgeoisie, jumping into bed with each other's wives and so on and so forth. And yes, partly what they're doing is trolling, sure, but they're actually, I think, doing something really interesting, and they don't flesh this out. But I think one of the things this does is get at the way ideology works. There's something that Denise Riley says, which is really fantastic, where I don't have the quote exactly to hand, but she says, like, it's really ridiculous. This is in her book, The War in the Nursery. She says, like, it doesn't make any sense to think that an ideology only has effect if it is believed. Like, this just doesn't work. That's not how it works at all. And what they're saying in this bit, I think, is that, like, as opposed to elsewhere where we're saying, these are the ideas you propagate and this is what they do. Here, they're saying, these are the ideas you propagate. You break them systematically to understand what this means in terms of the dynamic of society. We can't focus on one or the other. We have to focus on, it's not enough to just say, oh, well, they're all liars and hypocrites. The point is, it's important that this system puts out these ideas and then systematically breaks them. Now, for myself, I would relate this to a whole variety of other stuff under bourgeois society, which is the kind of putting forward of certain liberal ideas which capitalism itself cannot deliver on. But here, what they're essentially saying is, in a more direct way, is that like these kind of moralist, sanctimonious ideas of like essentially kind of a misogynist view of the purity of womanhood and the family and so on, you purport to believe them. And not only are those ideas, questionable in themselves, but actually the system itself undermines them at every turn. So it puts forward something baleful and then undermines it in a baleful way. And I find that very rich. And there's more to be said about that. But in terms of what you're saying about the, what does family abolition mean? I know this has become a bit of a kind of tussle between leftists in recent years. And I mean, I'm not on social media, so I miss a lot of this stuff. But I feel like, for me, family abolition, worthy of the name, doesn't mean like we are going to rip you from the bosom of these people who are your family, who I don't care whether or not you love them, you're a communist, abolish them. Like, this is ridiculous. And in a sense, like, would it help if we said withering away? Maybe they should have said the withering away of the family. The point is that this institution isn't given by God, and it isn't given by history universally. And even if you think it predated capitalism, under capitalism, it is doing certain jobs, and they are not jobs that you want done. And therefore, to be a family abolitionist, to me, is simply to say that this particular version of this institution that is doing these jobs as it has to structurally under capitalism cannot stand. And part of the destruction of capitalism, the overthrow of capitalism, would be about like throwing all these supposed givens up in the air and saying, there's absolutely nothing inevitable about these things.
And letting kinship
right.
be liberated from the constraints imposed upon it by capitalism.
Yeah. Kinship, families of choice, kithship. I really don't care what it's going to be like on the assumption that it's going to be better, which I think, if you don't follow that wager, then why would you be a socialist? But sort of like after 100 years of communism, if someone finds that other special someone and they really, really want to have, as a fully flowered human being with, in a situation of grassroots democracy, they want to have a kind of, what looks from the outside, if you like a kind of traditional family. I don't care. The point is it would be doing something very different because the situation would be very different.
It wouldn't be like so compulsory or compulsory at all.
Yeah. And compulsory or even given, because a lot of the compulsory things we have, we don't think of them as compulsory. We just think that how could it be any other way?
Right.
And, in a way, I suppose, I hope I do a better job of this in the book, but in a day-to-day, I'm not very good at having this argument because I simply don't understand why people get so worked up about it. And I know there's a tactical question, which is, don't say family abolition in front of the liberals because it scares them, which I think is just ridiculous. Like we're not going to get all kinds of shit thrown at us no matter what we say. But at least I understand the logic of the tactical position. The debates about family abolition, when they get into a much more kind of vituperative existential question of socialism, I just don't really understand the depth of the concerns, to be frank.
The point you made a few minutes back about the ideological Marx and Engels' emphasis on the hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie. I just want to underline that because it's really interesting. It's sort of hypocrisy is constitutive of power systems. And I mean, so many examples come to mind from like Ron DeSantis getting married at Disney World or Jerry Falwell Jr. getting into all kinds of swinger type stuff to just, like liberal American, power brokers claiming that America has been this force for spreading democracy and freedom around the world. It's sort of constant.
Yeah, when the first draft of the book, I tried to go into this a bit more. And to be honest, it became so much its separate thing that with a slightly heavy heart, I had to cut it out. But I feel like a lot of the discussion around ideology revolves around, the stated ideas and what they do, or hypocrisy understood almost as a sort of somewhat individualized transgression. Like, not only do these people put forward these ideas, they don't even believe it themselves or whatever. It's like, well, fine, but how do we understand a system that both takes its own ideas very, very seriously and also constitutively and systemically creates structural hypocrisy? Like that's that is something I would like to think about more.
Colonialism and globalization are key to Marx and Engels' analysis, both causally in terms of what propelled the rise of capitalism in Europe, and also, I think, in terms of the inherent movement toward the constitution of a capitalist world system. Quote, "The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development." End quote. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. It's a system, they write, that relies on, quote, "raw materials drawn from the remotest zones, in the place of old wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes." And lastly, there's so many good lines on this, quote, "The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West." What's this importance they assign to capitalism's inherently globalizing character? And do they indeed see its globalization vis-a-vis European colonialism as a progressive force in world history? Because there's some ambivalence here. The essential scare quotes that they put around European civilization raises some questions about just how civilized the European bourgeoisie are. A lot has been made by some commentators about the moments of the manifesto that seem to condone European conquest, but others have documented how much Marx's own positions on questions of colonialism changed and shifted as it escalated alongside the resistance of colonial subjects. So what is the assessment? Because there does seem to be this ambivalence where there's both, again, the awe of the sort of dynamism of the bourgeoisie that's required to lay the groundwork for communism to actually come. But there's also, at the same time, a sense that it is the European bourgeoisie who are the true barbarians.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I mean, as you say, so-called civilization, another formulation that they use, which, let's not underestimate quite how radical that was. Like, let's not underestimate it, because there's a lot of ink spilt, and to be clear, some of it perfectly fairly about certain kind of Eurocentric predicates in Marx and Engels and so on, and that's all perfectly fair. But I do think it's worth stressing, I think it's Robin Kelly who stressed this, I've forgotten, that like quite how radical the mere fact of using those scare quotes at that time, that's not to be sniffed at. Now, I think it's perfectly fair to say that their positions developed and that their anti-colonialism at a political level became much more developed and became much stronger and more theoretically fleshed out later on than here. So I certainly wouldn't want to say like there's no problems or that it's just, they had a position that they followed through all the way. That isn't true at all. And the later Marx and Engels are more nuanced about this. At the same time, I would find it hard to really sign off on the idea that they justify, now that's a loaded term. It's predicated on sort of ethical philosophy. I think what is fair to say is that at certain points in the manifesto, they see as inevitable. They don't celebrate the fact, but they do see it as, inevitable, and ultimately, it's an invidious term to say historically progressive. Let's try and avoid putting it that way. But this sense that, like, having done this task, we will now be in a better place for global communism, which I think is a position they move away from. And you can see that even in the afterwards to the manifesto themselves. In later editions, they start to entertain the notion of essentially moving beyond capitalism without passing through kind of bourgeois society, bourgeois capitalism based on different premises and so on. But even early on, that sense of inevitability isn't a celebration, and they are never less than clear-faced about the brutality of what's going on here. So even if at certain moments there may be a kind of heavy heart sense that this is simply something that is going to happen, and we have to get through it so that we can get to a better world, that doesn't mean that they efface the crimes of colonialism. It doesn't mean that they have any kind of dewy eyes about the civilizing mission, in inverted commas, of colonialism, which again puts them very far radically ahead of even the left wing of, frankly, even a lot of the workers' movement at this point. Tragically, even ahead of the many of the Paris Communards in 1871, even after the overthrow of the Commune, still supported some version of the civilizing mission. Not the sainted Louis Michel, to whom all love and honor, but I think those famous scare quotes, they're not just a stylistic flourish. They're making an important point there. Let's stress that section you quoted about, cheap prices are the heavy artillery which knocks down the Chinese walls. Now, what might be missed by some modern readers is the fact that, on the one hand, they're making a point about the vigor of capitalism, which by this kind of relentless search for profits means lowering the prices of commodities, and that's one of the ways by which it spreads into the rest of the world. This is true. But what they're also doing there is making a very direct analogy with the Opium War, so-called, by which Britain basically opened up the Chinese market to its opium. Britain, the great drug pusher of the 19th century, and to open up, one of the key cities to the opium trade that the Chinese authorities did not want in, the British Navy literally used heavy artillery on a city, bombed the shit out of a city, killed loads of people. Now, I think this is doing two different things. I think on the one hand, Marx and Engels, in a highly unusual way, are constantly stressing the sheer barbarity, the murderous barbarity of colonialism. Even if they see it as inevitable, they're certainly not justifying or celebrating it, and they're pointing out the brutality and murder with which it happens. Now, I would go further, and I would say one of the other things that's really interesting about this, and that could be really fleshed out, is that they see, in a way that even many of their followers today, I think, don't, is the inextricability of violence and market relations, of political state force and a notionally free market. When they talk about the inevitability of colonialism, I mean, I think even that has two faces. Because they have a sense of communism as very much not an ascetic moment. They see it as built on plenty. This is a not designed to be a kind of an equality down. It's designed to be a kind of radical grassroots democracy up, not down. Because of that, they have an analysis where they see communism as only possible to emerge out of developed capitalism. And for that reason, you can read some of their inevitability talk as saying that this has to happen so that the world is ready, and this is where there's almost a certain ethical bravery in their position, which is to say these terrible we don't deny the fact that these terrible things are going to happen, and it's a horrible thing, and we're going to keep talking about them because ultimately we're going to move to a better position. Let's be clear, they moved away from this, and I think it's wrong, but they aren't doing what a lot of people, particularly a lot of liberals, do, which is if you see something is inevitable, you make a virtue of it and you sort of try to integrate it into your program. So there is a certain kind of bleak rigor about that. But there's also merely an analytical thing, which is that they are saying this is what capitalism is going to do. This is what's going to happen. This is how it works. And on that level, they were kind of right. Yeah. Now, they were wrong about a lot of the details. They were wrong about, they did have this sense about the kind of flattening down and the creation of a world culture and so on. And they were wrong about that. And they very clearly, they acknowledged that later on, and not even very long later on. I think Marx's positions on these started to shift very early. But it is, again, this isn't a question of special pleading. It's a question of trying to understand the model. And part of what they're doing, which can be glossed as, quote, justifying colonialism, is saying, hey, this is how capitalism works, and this is what it's going to do. And it's going to do it by racing remorselessly and brutally through all these other countries and all these other nations, and it's not going to care how much blood it spills. Now, I don't think that's justifying it at all. I think that's about saying these are the real fruits of your capitalist so-called civilization, and this is why we need to move beyond it.
Yeah, it's exposing capitalism. It's saying this purportedly free contract of exploitation, it relies on this relentless expropriation or primitive accumulation, this violence of colonialism. This is the actual reality. And there's a lot of other gray lines in other Marx texts about that as well.
Exactly. Now, I do think we should say that for all that, it is true that there is not enough of a sense of agency of people within these societies that are being subsumed into capitalism under formal and or real subsumption. It doesn't have enough of a sense of the way that will be an uneven process, and the way formal subsumption doesn't mean that you're not really capitalist, and it may mean the changing of certain pre-existing situations, nor do they integrate enough a sense in which the ways people might fight back against this, the political resistance they can put up, and or ultimately, different roads through or beyond to a different social setup rather than through their model of industrial capitalism. So I don't want to come away from this discussion suggesting that this is a flawless passage. It absolutely isn't. And it's no coincidence that this is one of the longest sections of my book. But I do think a lot of the criticism of it is wrong-headed and underestimates the extent to which this was a position based on an excoriating rage at the brutality of colonialism as inextricable from capitalism.
There's a remarkable line where they write that the communists are, quote, distinguished from the other working class parties by this only. One, in the national struggles of the proletarians of different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. Two, in the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. I mean, in a way, it seems like 1 and 2 are making the same point, that communists act as a leading and cohering force of the larger working class movement. And the way that they do that is by articulating the fundamental internationalism of the communist movement and the workers' movement. Why for Marx and Engels does the global nature of the capitalist mode of production require an internationalist struggle to overcome it? And why is this such an overriding priority? Because in terms of things that should be notable, I think, for someone writing at the time, is just how relentlessly universalist this is.
Yeah. This is one of those areas in which we have to distinguish between the rhetorical register. So, famously, when they say the workers have no country or the working man has no country, this is sometimes read as meaning that they think nationalism has no hold over the working class. Now, I follow Hal Draper, who rather says that actually what this is a kind of stern instruction to the working class activist,
right?
And is saying, stop identifying with your nation state, stop identifying with your country. This is not your friend,
Or like they say at the end, workers of all countries unite.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a very simple sense in which they see communism and the revolution as necessarily international, which is that they also see capitalism that way. And they, one of the things that they are, that they stress almost from the word go is the dynamism of capital is not only internal, it's external. It spreads throughout the globe. It goes everywhere because of this dynamic of maximization and exploitation. Now, I think there's partly an ethical injunction here, which is, what's the point of having an incompletely liberated world? But I think, at a kind of more sort of systemically necessary level, this is a question about their analysis of the fact that they don't deny that national economies exist, but that they are inextricable from a global system, and that global system is going to be predicated on these class relations and this accumulation that has been identified. And that, therefore, you're not actually talking about a self-contained economic mode of production, a self-contained economic and class system anywhere in any one place that doesn't extend into all the other places. So that doesn't mean that everything has to happen everywhere all at once, to riff off the film. But what it does mean is that, if what we're talking here is about a systemic transformation, which is absolutely what they're talking about, you are necessarily talking about a systemic transformation everywhere, because these things are all interrelated, and the system itself is international. So the rupture with that system also has to be international and has to be total.
Let's turn to Marx and Engels' theory of the capitalist state. Quote, "The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie." What are they arguing here about the connection between the economic revolution of industrial capitalism and the political revolution of liberalism? And is their assertion that the state merely reflects bourgeois interests? This, of course, would prove to be the object of considerable debate in Marxist theory and remains so today.
It does remain so. I can attest from the, as if I needed it, but from the somewhat testy, not exactly fan mail I've received from some quarters about my deviations from certain classical positions. I think, again, this document is what it is. This is a polemical and performative utterance, and to the extent that what they are saying is, that the capitalist state is about the replication of capital and the replication of capital accumulation, and that is pushed by and in the service of the bourgeoisie, who war among themselves but are all committed to this question of accumulation, you can certainly understand what they're gesturing at, as opposed, and I think this is important, to those people. That formulation can't be considered in opposition to those people who might have had a desire to turn to the state to request reforms, to make things better, to sand the rough edges of capitalism, or even do something more kind of fundamental. And what they're partly saying is it will never do that, because that's not what it's for. Now, the formulation also lends itself to a rather reductive and kind of conspiratorial reading of sort of a smoke-filled room where a certain group of people decide on, a line in a very, very reductive way to maximize their profits. Now, the moment you say that, you have to bear in mind that exactly happens a lot of the time. There are plenty of smoke-filled rooms in which conspiracies of capitalists get together to decide, like a committee, their interests and what laws they should be. So even that parodic vision is hardly without some traction today. But there are also other modes. There are also other modes of the state, and I think that it's very important to stress that the bourgeoisie, not only do they not agree on everything, they are always fundamentally at war with each other, and Marx and Engels are very clear about this. So, what can a committee for their interests mean, given that they're constantly at war? It's always going to, there's always going to be some who are more pro whatever comes out than others. All it can really mean at some level is a kind of a situation to maintain the conditions for the replication of capital. But I'm also not convinced, I think that to sort of say that once you've nailed that, you've really got down to the fundamental secret of the state and there's not much left to be said, bar the details, is just not very helpful. To the extent that one wants to criticize Marx and Engels' model and say, well, actually, you can use the state to sort of reform or even get rid of capitalism, I think this is, I really have I don't agree with that. I think, and that's that sense in which that very simple statement, I can still see some traction for, because in the final instance, if you like, in the last analysis, it is, I do think that the actually existing state under capitalism is indeed inextricable from capitalism itself, and that does ultimately mean bourgeois interests.
Interestingly, though, Marx and Engels do in the Manifesto put forward a minimum program, what one might call, maybe sloppily and retroactively, but non-reformist reforms.
Yeah, transitional program.
Yeah, including the, quote, concentrating means of communication and transportation in the hands of the state, or, quote, a heavily progressive or graduated income tax.
Yeah.
Given that communism is in some ways presented as this fundamentally ruptural program that will not only be a rupture with capitalism, but with all hitherto known modes of production, because it will be the first ever to not have one group oppressing another. What do you make of that existing alongside in the manifesto, these things that look like reforms?
It would be the first ever beyond certain kind of non-class
hunter-gatherer societies.
Right. One of the things that's interesting about Marx and Engels' minimum program is quite how minimal it is. In some of the propositions are incredibly mild and really startling. I don't think one should get too in the weeds on this, in the sense that the specific proposals that they made, they were very clear almost immediately, and from all the future editions on. Look, don't focus on these specifically. Some of these still work. Some of them were superseded by history. Like, that's not really their point. Their point, as you say, is to try to embody non-reformist reforms, by which one means reforms that can be undertaken under the existing situation of capitalism, but that in their logic push so far against the defining logic of capitalism, the defining dynamics of capitalism, that they end up kind of opening up a space and creating a kind of fissure, which make it more likely that further and more radical demands and movements will push through. So it's kind of a reform in capitalism to weaken capitalism itself. And I would say what you can learn from that is, one, Marx and Engels' position on the state didn't preclude them having a sort of day-to-day horse trading relationship with the state. I mean, it was very rough horse trading, but they certainly didn't do that which we might call some ultra-lefts do, which is essentially sort of say, like, any engagement with actually existing capitalism or the capitalist state is just propping up capitalism, so not going to have any part of it. They didn't do that. And then I suppose what you can say is, there's the model of the non-reformist reform, and then there's the specific non-reformist reforms. Now, you can say Marx and Engels were wrong about their specific reforms. Their argument was like, these were right at the time and in the context in which we put them. They would now change. They would be different country to country, year to year, etc. But the model itself is one that I find quite compelling, because, as in the model of trying to push a non-reformist reform, because it seems to me to cut with the way that people's lives work, the way that the state works across a variety of different forms, and always mindful of the fact that what this can become, if you like, is merely reformism. And also always mindful of the fact that there can always be a sort of reasonable disagreement about what is and is not a reform that pushes against reformism, and that if people disagree with that doesn't necessarily mean that one or other is a traitor. It might be a sort of reasonable disagreement. I find that a fairly compelling model of a way to do day-to-day politics, as someone who is committed to ruptural politics, as in a complete rupture with the everyday logic of how we do things under capitalism. To me, almost more than revolution, which is not to resile from the word revolution, but because I find it more productive, the word rupture, which recurs in the manifesto, is the word that I keep returning to, that keeps being important to me. They talk about the most radical rupture. They talk about, and I find that very moving, and I find that very almost breathtaking, because there is this paradox of this kind of politics, which is that what you're ultimately seeking for is what you could call a red sublime, the absolute overturning of the everyday, the absolute reconfiguring of the everyday, and the construction of and by, as Engels said, an entirely different kind of human material. You're not talking here about us changing what we do. In the changing, we change ourselves. Like, the scale of this is so moving. And this is partly what makes them part of a kind of millenarian tradition, almost a kind of religious tradition, which some leftists don't like. They consider it a canard or a slur. I am fine with that, because I think these are very noble aspirations. But this red sublime, how do you do it? progressive income tax, I mean, talk about bathos, talk about underwhelming, and that, if you like, is the lived reality.
But it feels real. It feels real as someone who does political organizing.
Exactly. That's what exactly. This is like what it is to be a revolutionary socialist, to be a communist, is to spend your life in this kind of occasionally joyful, mostly melancholy oscillation between like these like ecstatic senses of alterity and potentiality and the most tedious day-to-day minutiae of like, drab little reforms, because there's no other way to do it. So I find it funny, and I find it sweet, and I find it poignant, and I find it moving, and I find it convincing.
Let's talk about what communism would look like, which Marx and Engels are famously rather vague about. Quote, "In the place of old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all." Is this where we see a move from Marx and Engels, the cold-blooded analysts of history, to just a fundamentally ethical position?
Well, Marx and Engels throughout the Manifesto and indeed beyond are fairly adamant that they don't have an ethics. This is not an ethical position. They don't now. And as you'll know, you read the book, I think they're wrong about that. I think they absolutely do have an ethical position.
Normative claims are being made.
Right. And it's not only an ethical position. And also there's absolutely nothing wrong with having an ethical position. Normative claims should be made, can indeed imply ought under certain circumstances and so on. So, in terms of like the actual question of to what extent this is an ethics, I think it is. And I think that in their eagerness to differentiate themselves from, if you like, moralistic socialism, they somewhat bent the stick too far and sort of said, there's no such thing as morals, and also there's an edgelord thing. They're like, you keep talking about ethics, man. We don't care about ethics. And it's like, okay, all right, calm down. But so I think they do have an ethics, and I think you're absolutely right. It is not an ethics of equality. That's not what concerns them. It's not what it is an ethics of liberation. It's an ethics of full human freedom. So equality is in the service of that rather than the other way around. And so, yes, so their ethics of a horizon is an ethics of a liberated humanity, which comes with a set of concomitant claims. We are not liberated people. I agree with them. It is not impossible that we could be liberated. I agree with them, which doesn't mean that everything is therefore fine and perfect. No one is saying that. And that it would be better to be liberated than not be liberated. In terms of what that means for a vision of communism, I'm going to follow Marx and Engels and refuse to speculate. And actually, it should be said, Engels got a bit agitated with Marx, and he asked him to spell out a couple of times. He was like, I really wish you would describe communism more because people keep asking for it. And Marx wouldn't do it. And he, famously said he wouldn't, preempt the cookbooks of the future. For me, and I am well aware that there are people who I would stand in comradeship with who really disagree with me on this, and that's fine. This is a legitimate debate. For me, I have no problem with like speculating. I have no problem with like dreams of what might be nice, of what one would like, and so on. But I do have an analytical problem with extrapolating that into not even just blueprints, but kind of trying to formulate how it might work. And the reason for that is not out of a kind of cowardly evasion. It's to do with what I was saying before. It's to do with the red sublime, by which I mean, our whole minds are constructed in the context of the reality we live in. We are creatures of racial capitalism, whether we oppose it or not. That's not the point. The point is our structures of opposition, our structures of feeling are all predicated on it. One of the wages of being a communist is that doesn't mean we can never escape it, but it does mean that in the escaping of it, in the fissures within, finding those fissures within our own mind and within society and pushing through them, we would transform ourselves, as Engels says, just as much as we would transform society. And we would become material capable of living in a liberated world. It would be the process of liberating ourselves that would make us fit to live in the world for liberated people that we would make. And what that means is that it is literally impossible for us to really, really imagine communism, not because of some kind of fiat of God or something, but from a very simple point of social psychology, which is that it is beyond our ken. And it is in the process of getting from here to there that we would be able to imagine what we need. So I can say in very abstract terms, this would be predicated on a liberated humanity. It would not be predicated on very, very much kind of asceticism. It would be predicated on a reasonable proliferation of like comforts of food and shelter and so on. What it would mean culturally, what it would mean politically and so on, I don't know. And I'm aware that when I say this, some people feel like it's just a real evasion or whatever, that it's just ducking the question. But the thing is, I think this kind of model of things happens all the time, in the same way as, someone who is very prejudiced against a particular group, someone who's very homophobic or whatever, and might think, you think about the famous cases of the miners' strike in the UK and the support of the miners by large sections of the queer community. And in one year, there might be certain people who would have very strongly homophobic opinions, partly because it would just be unthinkable that they would believe they know anyone gay, or that, or that there's anything other than, quote, disgusting about being gay, or whatever it might be. And then 2 years later, in the context of having, struggled together with certain people, in the context simply of meeting people, in the context of changing their own relationship to their own politics and the politics of other people, stand in comradeship with ACT UP or whatever. This is not rocket science. It happens all the time. And all we're talking about is doing that on a mass global systemic level. So it is out of fidelity to the necessity of a better world that I refuse to speculate too exactly about what that would be. All I need to know is that there's a chance that the effort could work, and that there's a reasonable chance it would be better than this. And let's look the fuck around us. I think that wager is worth taking.
Well, China Miéville, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
China Miéville is a best-selling writer of fiction and nonfiction, and a founding editor of the journal Salvage. He's the author of A Spectre Haunting on the Communist Manifesto. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after reminding workers of the world to unite, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes typically every week, but a little less often during July and August. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. We're recorded at WBRU in Providence. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Tammuz Frankel and Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theoria Francos and Ben Miéville. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it is on iTunes or some other such platform, please rate and review us. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. Also, if you know some way to stop Spotify from shadow banning us or whatever the hell is going on over there, please do help. It is impossible to find The Dig on Spotify. Anyhow, those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, so to spreading the word to your friends. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.